So the last thing we're going to talk about today is kind of tissue repair. So what happens if you have a cut on your skin? What are the actual steps of healing and how does this process work? Okay, so we're going to talk about this. So we'll call this tissue repair. And this is going to happen anytime the body's barriers, so we'll say body's barriers are compromised. Okay, so what's going to happen is that we're going to have two responses. We're mainly going to talk about just one today, but we'll have kind of an inflammatory response. And we will have an immune response. Okay, so inflammatory, immune response. Now, the inflammatory response and the immune response are going to be slightly different from each other. So we're going to talk mostly about the inflammatory, but let me just kind of start this again. So inflammatory. Now, inflammatory response is very quick, okay? So it's going to be quick. So this is happening right after you have some type of injury take place. And it's going to be non-specific. Okay, so this is just kind of the general reaction that the body has when there has been some type of damage to the barrier, okay? This is different from the immune response because immune response is slower because it is highly specific. Okay, so very specific response. All right. And because we're talking mainly about kind of the beginning of the tissue repair, we're going to talk about the kind of the inflammatory response. Okay, and so repair starts quickly and is a function of the inflammatory response. Now, there are two different ways that kind of regeneration and repair can take place. And so we're going to talk about those two ways. Okay, so their repair kind of has two major pathways. We'll call that. So repair occurs via two major pathways or ways. Okay, the one way is regeneration. Okay, and so in this case, what happens is you have the destroyed tissue is replaced with the same type of tissue. Okay, so we have replaces destroyed tissue with the same kind of tissue. Okay, so what that's saying is that the tissue that you started with before it was destroyed is what is then replaced in the same tissue. Okay, because of this, this allows for the original function to be restored. Okay, because it's the same type of tissue, it's going to be restored, it's going to be able to function in the same way. So that's going to be regeneration. There's a different type, kind of that can go a different pathway, and I'll explain why it goes these different pathways, but the second type is called fibrosis. Okay, and so what happens in this case is it replaces destroyed tissue with scar tissue. which is dense connective tissue. Okay? Because it's not the correct type of tissue, the original function is going to be lost. Now, you might say, why would we have fibrosis ever happen? We'd want regeneration to happen. But the type of repair that occurs is going to depend on two things. Okay, so type of repair. So when I say type of repair, I mean meaning either regeneration or fibrosis, is going to depend on, one, the type of tissue damage, and two, the severity of the injury. So you can imagine that something that's very severe would most likely have a more difficult time repairing. Okay, so we're now going to start going through the steps of the inflammatory response. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through these steps. On the PowerPoint that I gave you, I have a blank kind of tissue images so that you can practice kind of discussing what's happening in each of these stages. But I'm going to first write it on another piece of paper and then we'll come back to these images. Okay, so we're going to first talk about this first step. There's a second step and then a third step that we'll talk about. Okay, so there's 1, 2, and 3. So we'll talk about that. So this first step of tissue repair is called, or we're going to title it, inflammation sets the stage. Okay, so what's happening is that there's some type of trauma, and the trauma is going to injure tissue cells. It may injure mast cells, which are one of the cells that we can find in the tissues. And when that happens, those tissues are going to release inflammatory chemicals. Okay, so it's like they've been cut and then they're going to release these chemicals. What those inflammatory chemicals will then do is they will make the local blood vessels become leaky. Okay, so we'll say inflammatory chemicals make local, so any blood vessels in the local area, blood vessels leaky. So what this does is it allows white blood cells, fluid, and clotting proteins to seep into the injured area. Okay. Now, one of those things we said clotting proteins. So those clotting proteins, what they're going to do is they will seal off injured area. Okay. This is going to prevent bacteria, toxins, and other harmful harmful substances from spreading. Okay. Now, when the clot becomes exposed to the air, it dries out and forms a scab. Okay, so clot dries and forms scab, which I assume everyone has gone through this process. Okay, so that's going to be kind of the first step. And so you'll have kind of white blood cells that are gonna be allowed to kind of enter because of the leakiness of the blood vessels in this area. You're gonna also have platelets, so clotting factors that are going to come in here, and they're gonna start to form this clot. Okay, so all of that is then going to kind of start off this process. It's all triggered by the actual inflammatory chemicals, okay? So actually, these are inflammatory chemicals because they're actually going towards the blood. So then they're going to call into action other parts. These are going to be the white blood cells, but we'll also have clotting factors that will also be released into here. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step is going to be kind of an organization of the area, and the blood supply is going to start to be reorganized. Okay, so we're going to call this one organization. Restores the blood supply. Okay, so beneath the clot, so we have this clot that's formed. Beneath the clot, there is going to be kind of a growth of a new type of tissue. Okay, so we're going to say clot is replaced by ingrowth. So this is under of fragile capillaries. Okay, and the tissue that forms is called granulation. So this is special tissue that forms after an injury. Okay, so special tissue. It's often going to be delicate, pink, okay, and has lots of capillaries. So lots of capillaries. So if you've ever picked a scab, you know that right beneath it is often very pink and fragile, and often it will start bleeding again if you actually pick that scab off. In addition to the clot and what's going on here, this granulation tissue, there are going to be fibroblasts that are going to multiply and produce growth factors. Okay, and collagen fibers that will bridge the gap between kind of the two sides of the injury. Okay, so fibroblasts multiply, produce growth factors, and collagen fibers that will bridge the gap. Okay, we also are going to have macrophages be present at this time. So macrophages. Okay, and so they will actually eat. So kind of eat the dead cells or any dying cells and other debris. So anything that's kind of not supposed to be there. Now, this is kind of lower down. So when we're looking at this, this is the area that we're going to have that granulation tissue, lots of blood vessels down here. You can start to get the tissue, the fibers of the collagen growing. And then up higher, you're going to start having the epithelial cells multiply and kind of start to fill in the gap that was left when there was the injury. So this last part is going to be surface epithelium or epithelial cells. I spelled that wrong. Sorry. Multiply and begin to migrate over granulation tissue. Okay, so kind of here's the granulation tissue and here's the going to be the actual epithelial tissue start to divide. All right, the last step, go through a lot of paper doing this, is going to be regeneration and fibrosis affect permanent repair. Okay, so kind of depending on what type of repair there's going to be, you know, depending on if the damage was severe enough, you can have kind of affect how this is going to go. Okay, so the fibrosed area matures and contracts, which pulls the margins of the wound, together. Okay, so if we're looking at this, it's going to start pulling the gap, you know, that was formed here together. So it's going to start removing. Okay, as it regenerates, the epithelia thickens, okay, and a fully regenerated epithelium with an underlying area of scar tissue will result. Oops. Okay, so usually, I mean, you can have some damage that happens and it doesn't leave much of a scar, but often there's going to be some type of slight scar because you have the regenerated epithelium on top, but there is scar tissue underneath that. And kind of depending on that, so the scar may be white, depending on kind of the severity of the injury. Okay, so I don't know if you guys can see this very well, but I have this, I got this scar when I was in 6th grade. And so as you can see, it's still white to this day, much lighter than my normal skin color. And that is all going to be based off of kind of the process of fibrosis and the repair of this. Okay. Now, to end up this lecture, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the different types of tissues and how they can regenerate. So we'll call this regenerative capacity of different tissues. Okay, so we're going to say we'll have kind of three categories: the good, the okay, and kind of the no regeneration. So things that regenerate well are going to be epithelia, bone, areolar dense irregular, and blood forming tissues. The tissues that have okay regeneration are going to be smooth muscle and dense regular. And the tissues that have kind of no regenerative capabilities are going to be cardiac and nervous. And so kind of depending on where the injury is going to be, it's going to depend on kind of the tissue types that are there. When you have an organ that's been damaged, kind of the scar tissue that forms can sometimes limit the actual function of the organ. So for example, if you have damage to the heart and you have scar tissue that forms, it can prevent the heart from functioning in the way that it's supposed to do, kind of be able to pump. Okay, so that is going to be the end of the kind of tissue repair. So again, you can kind of go through the steps. Because of the way that the class is now running, there most likely will not be an essay question about kind of, stating the different steps of the tissue repair, but I would know the major things that are happening in each one to kind of recognize those and be able to answer questions based on that. All right, thank you.